I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, Russian forces split Ukrainian troops in the Kursk region and get closer to the border. Meanwhile, Russia targets a Ukrainian gas facility with missiles and drones just after Zelensky calls for a truce on attacks on infrastructure. On the political side, we discuss the consequences of the withdrawal of US intelligence to Ukraine, the French nuclear shield offer, and Russia's response to the idea of European peacekeeping forces in Ukraine. We also look to Washington to debrief the Hegseth and Healey summit. Finally, we talk with Sir Bill Browder and legal expert Yuliya Ziskina about using Russian frozen assets for defense and reparations in Ukraine.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 7th of March, 3 years and 12 days since the full-scale invasion began. I'm joined by Associate Editor for Defense Dominic Nicholls, former tank commander and chemical weapons expert Hamish de Breton-Gordon, and Defense Editor Danielle Sheridan, dialing in from Washington, D.C. But first, we've got a lot on today, Dom. Shall we start with the major battlefield updates?
Hi, Adélie. Hello, everybody. No Francis today, so me for military and political updates. So, the easy bit, no move to the front line in Ukraine. However, I think we can say two Russian military priorities became very clear yesterday. That's the ground war in Kursk and the air war in Ukraine. Now, on the ground in Kursk, the Kremlin is desperate to clear out the Ukrainian troops that are still holding that ground inside Russia. And in the air, Moscow is trying to destroy what it can of Ukraine's energy infrastructure, as that seems likely to be the priority demand from President Zelensky for any immediate measures in any future peace talks. So let's break this down. First to Kursk. Now, I reported yesterday that Russian troops had pushed from east to west into the southeastern flank of the lodgement that Ukraine still holds there. Now, this is about 5 kilometres or so south of the town of Sudzha. That advance continued yesterday and took another relatively large chunk of land. I say relatively, it was about 4 kilometres long, about 2 k's wide. Interestingly, in the same westerly direction, they did not prioritise trying to turn north to clear out the main defended position in Sudzha. However, as I said yesterday, they seem to be driving towards the border with Ukraine, and that theory seems borne out by yesterday's Russian gains. Now, if Russian forces are not yet at the border with Ukraine, I think they will be in very short order, almost certainly today, I would suggest. If they don't physically hold the ground, as you know, Ukraine may still be able to fire into it, have fire control over the last little bits of ground there. It is unlikely any Ukrainian troops will still be there by tomorrow, I think. That will leave a roughly square piece of Russian territory still in Ukrainian hands, about 8 kilometres on each side of that square, south of the main defended position around Sudzha. Now, it's never good news to have your forces separated like that, but as I've said before, the rear boundary of that remaining square, which actually for that square is the western and the southern flanks, is the border with Ukraine, and hence Ukraine holds the other side. So this is not good news at all. I'm not trying to suggest otherwise, but it is not catastrophic, as they still have clear logistic lines from Ukraine into Russia, into that bit of land in Russia that they still hold. Now, it is also somewhat understandable that Russia has been able to make that advance, given the effort they, and by extension North Korea, have put into trying to reclaim it in recent weeks. That effort is shown also by the fact that there was no move to the line in Ukraine at all yesterday, as I said, and the importance to the Kremlin of clearing out Ukrainian forces from Russia was illustrated by Putin yesterday on a visit to a veterans association. So, during a trip to the Defenders of the Fatherland Foundation's Moscow branch, Putin said Russia, quote, will not give up its own territory in any future peace negotiations. So you do know that that lodgement in Kursk is hurting him. next to the air war, and Russia last night launched a massive missile and drone strike on Ukrainian gas facilities, just hours after President Zelensky had called for a truce covering attacks on critical infrastructure, a call supported by Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Now, Russia initially launched a series of missiles about 4 a.m. local time, targeting various regions in the far west of Ukraine. Then a second series of missiles went into Ukrainian airspace about 6 a.m. Then this morning, Ukraine's Air Force says that Russia launched 194 drones and 67 missiles last night. Those missiles included 35 Kh-101 or Kh-55SM subsonic cruise missiles fired by the big Tupolev bombers from well inside Russia. They also launched 8 ship and submarine-launched Caliber cruise missiles, 8 Kh-59 or 69 variant air-launched cruise missiles, 3 Iskander-M, or the North Korean equivalent KN-23 ground-launched short-range ballistic missiles, and 4 S-300 or S-400 surface-to-air missiles that have been repurposed to be used as land attack weapons. Kyiv says both F-16s and French Mirage 2000 fighters took part in countering the strikes, which were aimed primarily at Ukraine's energy and gas infrastructure. Responding to that, Ukrainian Energy Minister Herman Galushenko said that it was clear that Russia was trying to hurt ordinary citizens, he said, as other strikes were reported on an apartment block in Kharkiv, injuring 4 people. He said the energy and gas infrastructure in various regions of Ukraine is under massive missile and drone shelling again. Russia is trying to hurt ordinary Ukrainians by shelling energy and gas production facilities without abandoning its goal of leaving us without power and heating and causing the greatest harm to ordinary citizens. So Kramatorsk, Kharkiv, Sloviansk, Odessa and Ternopil were targeted overnight with missiles launched from sea and air. The operational command of the Polish armed forces said it had to scramble 4 fighter jets and put air defence systems on alert because of the strikes. Now, amazingly, there were only, and please forgive that word only, but there were only 2 dead and 24 injured across the country yesterday. That speaks of the effectiveness of Ukraine's air defence and therefore how important the continuation of such weapon supplies is. Now then, finally, for the military bit, Militani, it's a Ukraine-based media company focusing on defence news. They're saying today that Maxar Technologies, the American aerospace company, has made the decision to limit Ukraine's access to its satellite imagery. A lot of the imagery you'll see on social media and in media organisations comes from Maxar. Now, Militani says that this was confirmed to them by several users of the commercial service. They didn't specify which services had been affected beyond saying the primary Maxar Technologies service had been revoked. The official explanation provided by Maxar's administration to users was that the restriction was made, quote, in response to an administrative request. It is, however, likely that's a result of Donald Trump's decision to withhold intelligence from Ukraine as a means of forcing them to the negotiating table. And as I said yesterday, we're still waiting to hear what concessions the White House has demanded of Russia to kickstart any peace process. Anyway, perennial thorn in Putin's side, Sir Bill Browder now I should say, he said in response to this looks like a well-orchestrated conspiracy by the US government to destroy Ukraine's ability to defend themselves. Of all my pessimistic scenarios about how this war would develop, this wasn't one of them. And that's the military updates, Adélie.
And yesterday there was a big summit in Brussels where all of the EU leaders gathered to talk defence. Dom, what's the latest with that?
So, yeah, you're absolutely right. The big news on the political and diplomatic front yesterday was the EU loving in Brussels. I said earlier in the week I thought that Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer would be invited to that, as this whole issue is bigger than just EU politics. However, he was not. I was quite surprised. Anyway, on to the summit. As well as talking money, and more on that shortly, for the first time there were formal discussions yesterday on the idea of France protecting more of Europe with its nuclear shield. In a move that's likely going to require a change to France's constitution, President Emmanuel Macron sought to take the lead on European defence in a move that could see French weapons housed in other European countries. The offer came after Friedrich Merz, Germany's Chancellor-in-waiting, said Berlin could ask for shelter under France and Britain's nuclear umbrella if the US pulled out of NATO. The decision on whether to use the deterrent would always remain in French hands. Now, as a reminder, France has not declared diplomatic speed for making available her air and sea-launched nuclear weapons to NATO. Now, mere talk of this idea, as you'd expect, incited fury from the Kremlin, with Vladimir Putin warning President Macron to remember the fate of Napoleon, whose 1812 invasion of Russia ended in a desperate and deadly winter retreat. Putin said, "There are still people who want to go back to the times of Napoleon, forgetting how it ended." Don't worry, Vlad, if they've forgotten, Francis will remind them. Anyway, on a televised speech on Wednesday night, Mr. Macron said Russia was, quote, a threat for France and Europe, and reminded the world that the war in Ukraine was already a global conflict. He said, "You are, I know, legitimately worried about the current events, which are disrupting the world order. To watch and do nothing would be madness. I want to believe that the United States will stand by us, but we need to be ready if that's not the case." It's worth noting that diplomatic sources warned that any plans for an extension to France's nuclear umbrella were at a very early stage, and that any negotiations on issues such as hosting French nuclear-armed fighter jets would be most likely bilateral between individual countries rather than a kind of EU agreement. Donald Tusk, the Polish Prime Minister, said, "This topic has come up in conversations with me several times. This is something worth considering." It's serious stuff. I'm not trying to downplay it at all. Personally, I would be very surprised if this idea went anywhere. France, as I said, has not declared its nuclear weapons to NATO, so it would be a seismic shift in policy to suddenly go from that to offering any kind of cover to Europe. And which Europe, I ask you? European NATO? The EU? The countries of geographic Europe? So what does it actually mean? Bear in mind that Britain has declared her nuclear capability to NATO, and that obviously covers most, if not all, of any area in Europe that might be under discussion. The decision for Britain, I think, is whether any thought about using that nuclear capability whatsoever could be taken without US input, regardless of whether or not Donald Trump pulls the US out of NATO. Now, the operational firing chain for the use of Britain's nuclear deterrent is entirely sovereign. The US cannot veto Britain's use. However, the development of the overall capability, the weapons, the boats, the comms, the shore-based infrastructure, can only happen if Britain and the US are absolutely in lockstep. Now, as a reminder, the submarines are essentially split into three. British bits at the front and the back, with a middle third, the command module, including the bit that does the weapons release, comprising lots of US technology. Then the missile itself, the Trident D5 missile, it's an American missile, but the nuclear bit at the front that goes bang is British. So there's lots of different tech just in the boats and the weapons, let alone the shore-based structures, the maintenance, all the comms, the global comms network. Lots of different technology, all being updated, maintained, repaired at different times, different schedules, with different parts being designed and made by Britain and America. So a lot of plates spinning here to produce a nuclear capability. And as I said, they need to be together entirely in lockstep for the whole thing to work. So it is not a simple shift to declare a wider umbrella to others that aren't already covered by it. Now then, to the money, and several EU members yesterday pledged at the summit to provide up to 15 billion euros, that's just over 16 billion US dollars, in additional aid for Ukraine. That's good. That was slightly less than the 20 billion euros that had been expected. European Council President Antonio Costa said immediately member states can increase their support thanks to the increased fiscal space. He was referring to the unanimous decision by EU leaders on a new defence initiative that could see up to 800 billion euros, nearly 870 billion US dollars, through loans and loosening fiscal rules for government spending freed up. Mr. Costa said several member states have already announced their pledges up to 15 billion euros. Today, we have also tasked the Council to work urgently on further initiatives to address Ukraine's pressing military and defence needs. This is a tipping point for Europe, and today we have shown that the European Union is rising to the challenge. Right, update your bingo cards, everyone. We're through. Europe has woken up. We're now at tipping point and rising to the challenge. So, lots going on yesterday. Let's go back briefly to Russia and that visit to the Veterans Association in Moscow, during which time Putin said something that caught my eye. I thought it was very interesting. He said Russia must choose a peace option that best suits Russia and will ensure peace in the long term. Nothing new there. It means peace on his terms. That is typical Russian and Soviet negotiating tactics, and in a negotiation what everyone starts out with. However, he then said that Russian societal unity is critical for Russian victory in Ukraine, at which point he alluded to the Russian Revolution, noting that Russian society collapsed during the First World War. He urged Russians to maintain support and unity. This report comes from the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War. I think it was very interesting that he obliquely referenced how his political room for manoeuvre over the war is absolutely tied to continued support from the Russian people, which is why he is terrified of any organised opposition, why he had Alexei Navalny murdered just over a year ago. Next then, sticking in Russia, in a press conference yesterday as well, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said the Kremlin will reject any proposals to station European peacekeeping forces in Ukraine to enforce a future ceasefire agreement. He said there was no room for compromise on that issue, and that Russia will consider the presence of a European peacekeeping force in Ukraine as akin to a NATO deployment in Ukraine. Right, this is the same old stuff. You may remember Moscow said that giving Ukraine permission to fire Western-supplied weapons into Russia was akin to NATO being directly involved in the war. Cue, lots of tough talk from Russia, but quick as a flash, nothing happened. Now, Lavrov also said yesterday that any peace agreement must account for the alleged quote-unquote root causes of the war. The main one in the Kremlin narrative, and one that is entirely false, being NATO's alleged violation of obligations not to expand eastward at the end of the Cold War. Now, to put to bed in everyone's minds, except those furiously determined to stick to the Kremlin's line on this, why this is rubbish, please stay for my final thoughts a little bit later, and I'll talk about that whole NATO expansion nonsense. Okay, a couple more from me, Adélie. The chief exec of Airbus Defence and Space, Michael Schöllhorn, has warned today in an interview with German news outlet Augsburger Allgemeine that Germany should reduce its dependence on US defence manufacturers. This is obviously amid the shifting political signals from Washington. And thank you to the Kyiv Independent for highlighting this article. Schöllhorn said that Berlin should prioritise European defence companies, particularly as Germany's likely next Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, has announced plans to raise almost €1 trillion for defence and infrastructure spending. That is a very big number. I think it was, 500 on defence and 400 on infrastructure, or the other way around. Anyway, big bucks. So Mr. Schöllhorn said, if we continue to buy off-the-shelf products from the United States with this higher defence spending, we are cementing our dependence on others. I wonder if the chief execs of Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman are applauding these calls for Europe's defence industrial base to grow, and I wonder if they welcome Trump's comments to increase defence industrial competition. Last one on the diplomatic front for now, for this week, Adélie. Ukrainians who fled to the US after the full-scale invasion are facing deportation under plans by Donald Trump to revoke their legal status. This comes from our colleague Iona Cleave. Sources have claimed the White House is proposing to fast-track the removal of 240,000 Ukrainians displaced by the conflict as soon as next month. Now, if correct, that would be an extraordinary reversal of the scheme and the welcome Ukrainians received under the Biden administration. The planned rollback of protections for Ukrainians was underway before last Friday's spat in the Oval Office. This comes from a senior Trump official and 3 sources close to the story. And it is part of a broader Trump administration effort to strip legal status for more than 1.8 million migrants allowed to enter the US under temporary humanitarian support programs launched by the Biden administration. Now, the White House has denied the report, saying no decision has been made at this time, and White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt called it fake news. That's the diplomatic stuff from this week, Adélie.
Let's look ahead to next week. Zelensky is going to travel to Saudi Arabia to meet with the Crown Prince and to talk with the US in the hope to reopen negotiations. What should we expect?
Yeah, there's so much going on at the moment. There's so much happening, if not on the battlefield, then certainly in the diplomatic space, that it is worth just a look ahead. We will obviously cover this next week, but just to get in people's diaries. Yeah, so next week, President Zelensky has said he will travel to Saudi Arabia on Monday to meet Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman before talks with US partners. He's then going to leave his team to meet the US delegates on Tuesday for substantive discussions that will probably take place on Wednesday, discussing the framework for a potential peace agreement. Now, yesterday in the White House, Donald Trump said, what's going to happen is Ukraine wants to make a deal because I don't think they have a choice. Not a million miles away from making an offer he can't refuse. But he said what's going to happen is Ukraine wants to make a deal because I don't think they have a choice. I also think that Russia wants to make a deal because in a certain different way that only I know, they have no choice either. God knows what he's on about there. Now, shortly afterwards, Trump's envoy for the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, told reporters outside the White House the idea is to get down a framework for a peace agreement and an initial ceasefire as well. And then in a somewhat loaded statement, he added, Ukraine is not only ready to take the necessary steps for peace, but we are also proposing what those steps are. Right. Ukraine's delegation is expected to be led by President Zelensky's Chief of Staff, Andriy Yermak, with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and Mr. Witkoff on the US side. Also next week, France will hold a meeting of defence ministers from Europe's 5 major military powers to discuss the support for Ukraine. This is going to be ministers from Britain, Germany, Italy and Poland will join France in Paris on Wednesday. That will follow a separate meeting of European military chiefs on Tuesday. And the defence ministers group, that will be the third meeting, previously met in Berlin in November last year and in Poland this year. And finally, for me, Adélie, spare a thought for Keith Kellogg. That's Trump's special envoy to Ukraine. Not only has he been largely sidelined in recent days, but he could well be looking for a new job, I reckon, in the near future. After joking yesterday at a filmed event at the Council on Foreign Relations, he said Trump promised to end the war in 24 hours, but he didn't say which day. Ho, ho, ho. All fun and games, but it will remind people that Donald Trump often says headline-grabbing things that then turn out to be harder to deliver than he'd first implied. And that is us up to date, Adélie.
And now we're going over to Washington, where Danielle Sheridan, our defense editor, has been covering the meeting between Pete Hegseth and John Healey at the Pentagon. Danny, what is the mood in Washington at the moment?
Yeah, there was a lot of excitement that John Healey had come over to meet with his counterpart. They met at the Pentagon yesterday, and I would say the music is tense. I think the UK's role is to show diplomacy, to act as a bridge between Europe and the States. They are desperate to make a deal work in Ukraine's favour and know that there are certain ways to deal with the Trump presidency and therefore can offer that advice. It's almost like a big brother role, if you will. And I say it's tense because everyone knows how much is riding on this. Defence Secretary Healey met with Defence Secretary Hegseth only last month, and now he's come out to the Pentagon in a short space of time to meet again. It's the first time they'd met in DC. And it just shows how important the UK understands its relationship with the US to be, to have made a real point of coming out in such short time to continue that, creating that bridge between the two. I say it's tense because the mood shifted in the room. So effectively, the two leaders met, sat down in the Pentagon. The press were then invited in. I was the only British journalist there. And someone from the Washington Post asked John Healey what he thought about the US basically playing into Putin's hand, looking for a deal that is pro-Russia. And Secretary Hegseth really hit back at that. He became incredibly agitated and just said, all the media cares about is narratives and you're going to keep spinning that we're pro-Russia. It's garbage. That's the word he used and what led to the story I wrote off the back of it. It's garbage to say that we're pro-Russia. That's not the case at all. All Trump cares about is getting a deal. He wants to stop the killing. That's what he's interested in. It's not anything to do with being pro-Trump. So take from that what you will. I'm interested to hear your interview with Bill Browder, because obviously, as Dom alluded to, that isn't the case that many feel the US is expressing. So it was interesting. And also it made me laugh because as I said, I was in the room and they were all sat around this long table with teapots on it. And each person had a little side plate with a cookie that had the American flag on and then the United Kingdom's flag on it, as if to really hammer home the special relationship the two have in edible form. And I also think it's worth noting that John Healey was flanked either side by Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, the head of the military, and Lord Mandelson. He didn't come alone, he came prepared with his two right-hand men, which show how seriously they are taking these talks. And what John Healey was expressing throughout the interview, really, that we were granted as press, was, all the words we've heard before. UK remains steadfast to help Ukraine. What we care about is peace. We've just seen GDP, spending on defence rise to historic levels. We're doing what we can to ensure Ukraine is supported. We're stepping up in Europe. We're showing leadership. Everything that we've already heard before, but amplified. The real question is, what happened behind closed doors? What was discussed? Did they say to Ukraine, you need to row back on this pause, you need to unfreeze military aid to Ukraine, you need to give us a backstop that has air power? What happens if Britain and France do send troops into Ukraine? Are they going in blind? Are they going to have the support of the Americans overhead? Are we really going to rely on this economic minerals deal to save the lives of troops? We don't want to put them in harm's way. But all of those questions weren't answered. The British are playing their cards really close to their chest. I think they're incredibly attuned to how sensitive things are at the moment and don't want things to be misinterpreted. So as I began by speaking, I think it was a tense situation, and I think it remained so. And now it really is a case of watch this step as diplomacy continues to unfold over the coming weeks.
And of course, this meeting comes after 2 heavy weeks of news where the US has asked Europe to step up in terms of defence and security for the continent. Now, John Healey was quoted saying the US had challenged Europe to step up, that they had challenged them to step up on Ukraine and on defence spending. And he responded, and I say to you that we have, we are, and we will further. Now, Danny, what has been Hegseth's reaction to that? And did you get a sense that this was encouraging from where we were a week ago?
I think he is encouraged. I think that they see that the UK has been serious on its role in Europe and has stepped up. And I think that there's no question that the States isn't happy with how the UK is performing. What I was describing earlier was more a frustration from the US's side that because of it's being very harsh with Ukraine and its treatment, it doesn't like the fact that people are then interpreting that as the US being pro-Russia. So there was tension in that respect. But in terms of how the US is viewing what the UK is doing, I think my interpretation was there's common respect. I think that they are happy with what the UK has done in terms of raising GDP. We know that they don't believe 2.5% is enough. It was reported, in fact, we reported it last month, that Trump actually wanted 5%, but he'd settled for 3.5%. No one has been able to get Keir Starmer to get anywhere near that figure. He's saying 3% by 2030. But I definitely got a real sense of camaraderie between Hegseth and Healey in terms of the special relationship. I think Hegseth was referring to the UK and its British military like brothers in arms. He used the word like we're warriors together. There definitely feels like there's an affinity between the two. And he did even say at points he sees how Europe, the UK more so, has stepped up. So yeah, I really came away with a sense that he's happy with what the UK is doing. Of course, they think we can do more because, as I just said, the percentage point determines that. But I don't think there's any kind of tension between the UK and the US. I think there's tension on the wider geopolitical picture in terms of just the relationship with Ukraine as opposed to the relationship between our two nations.
Danielle, I know you've got to dash, so you have a very busy day of reporting ahead. Thank you very much for joining. And now over to you, Hamish.
Yeah, Adélie, hi. Dom, hi. Very nice to be back on the pod again.
You had a piece in The Telegraph today called "Trump is behaving like a businessman, not a commander-in-chief." That was about the withdrawal of US intelligence to Ukraine. Now, Hamish, can you explain to us the repercussions of the US cutting intelligence to Ukraine and what other sources of intelligence they can rely on? Can Europe offer similar protection?
Yeah, certainly. I started off the piece trying to articulate the difference between business decision-making and military decision-making. I've had experience of both over the last 35 years. In the business world, obfuscation, uncertainty and confusion can be seen as a good thing in a classic sort of poker style. And we know how transactional Trump is. But those are the worst things when trying to make military decisions. And business is about dollars and pounds. Military is about people. So to oversimplify the two, I think, is quite dangerous. And the two elements that personify this and hopefully give some clarity to people listening is that there are two things that Trump has done recently. He has stopped military aid, and I'll come to that in a minute, and withheld intelligence. Now, in the Five Eyes community, the US, Canada, Britain, Australia and New Zealand, we all work together and share together. America is by far the bigger partner, but actually the UK, certainly from the intelligence side, the secret intelligence service and all the rest of it, we punch pretty heavily here. And it gives us a lot of leverage because the Americans wouldn't want to be at that. So the intel side, what are we talking here? We're talking about satellites. We're talking about all the ints, the human, the MASINT and everything else. So what does it do? Well, without the ability of the Ukrainians to have this stuff, the Russian forces are blinded to the Ukrainians. So they can pretty much do what they like, unfettered, as it were, at the moment. Dom's given a really good explanation today of what's happening on the ground. Interesting, the incursion into Kursk. I've been speaking to a few people who know about these things, and some sources reckon that 50% more Russian drones and missiles got through last night than perhaps they have in the past. Now, these are very broad brush figures, but is that possible? Well, yeah. The key element that American intelligence gives is targeting data and all that sort of stuff, surveillance, tracking. So there may well be something in there. So withholding the intelligence allows the Russians freedom of maneuver, which as a military person, that's what we want. We want to be able to do the things that we want to do rather than the enemy directing us to do things. So I think we saw for the first time in a long time missiles launched from the Black Sea Fleet, suggesting that they are getting more freedom of maneuver than they had done in the past. So that is why the intelligence piece is so important. We heard the French saying yesterday that they would try and plug the gaps. I'm sure we in the UK are trying to plug the gaps, but we cannot come close to providing the capabilities that the Americans have hitherto. Interesting, Dom talked to that, the Maxar technologies, commercial satellite imagery. One understands that the Ukrainians have heavily relied on that for identifying Russian forces. So to have that blocked out, and part of my piece is saying, if I was Putin, that Putin was Trump, I'm trying not to be too simplistic or naive, would I be doing anything else? Well, I'm not sure. We can argue this long and hard. And of course, as you said, Hegseth said it's garbage that Trump is in Putin's camp. Of course he's not, but some of the decisions he's moments seem pretty strange. So if we then go on to the holding of the weapons, psychologically, it's huge. And on the battlefield, psychology to physical is 10:1. Clausewitz, a great military philosopher, one of his many really sensible dits was clout, don't dribble. And what he meant there is you've got to really hit the enemy hard. You can't dribble. And one of Trump's criticisms of us in Europe is that we've dribbled our capability in support of Ukraine. And he's right to a certain degree. I think Britain's greatest general was Field Marshal Bill Slim, and he put it rather more simply for a soldier for me to understand, is that you've got to hit the other fellow as hard as you can where it hurts him most when he ain't looking. But you need the intelligence and weaponry to be able to do that. So the withholding of weapons, you've only got 10 missiles in the cupboard and you've still got to fight for the next 6 or 10 weeks or however long. You're going to be very careful on how you use those weapons. And the ATACMS missiles and the HIMARS missiles that are so crucial to attacking over the border and hammering the Russians there. At the moment, the Ukrainian targeted are having to test and adjust because of that. So I think when you put all this together, I can feel why Zelensky is feeling slightly unbalanced and feeling as though the person who has been wronged most, the possibility that Ukraine is going to have to trade some of that territory that the Russians have stolen off them, what one can sympathise with them absolutely. So that was the theme of my piece, business decision-making and military. In Trump's perfect world, yeah, if he can do great business deals and he thinks he can replicate them on the battlefield, well, that's not quite how it works because lives are at stake. And as we've heard, people are dying because of some of the decisions already made. And before we move on, perhaps, Adélie, just a piece on the French nukes. I know Dom has done a really thorough job on it, but I just have a couple of issues. You have done a lot of good research here and very impressive for a cavalry officer and a helicopter pilot, I must say. But I think that there are three things that I would like to not contradict in any way, but just add to this. Of course, the nuclear word pricks everybody's ears up for quite good reasons. The interesting thing about the French capability, and in pure horsepower terms, they're pretty similar to us Brits, but we're way smaller than the Americans and the Russians. But what the French have, what we don't have, is what we call tactical nuclear weapons. These are battlefield nuclear weapons, which we in the UK don't have. The Russians have threatened to use them an awful lot, but a battlefield nuclear weapon is for taking out big armoured formations and airfield camps, that sort of thing, but still have a huge impact. Slightly allied to this, and I'm very conscious that people in Westminster and Whitehall and various buildings up and down the Thames listen to this pod. So I would say I'm not giving away any state secrets, but I think it is well aware that the Americans plan to reposition tactical nuclear weapons again in this country. And interestingly, Trump, I think, said it must have been yesterday, maybe last night, that we should get rid of all our nuclear weapons. So I think my point being is that the nuclear issue really gets people up and looking. But I stand fast what the French are saying. With the French and the British nuclear capability, I think there is a viable umbrella if the Americans decide to step out, which I don't think they do. So I hope that gives a little bit of addition to what Dom was covering earlier on. Over.
Do you think the cutting of US intelligence will have an effect on the British Storm Shadow missiles?
That is a very good question. No, I don't think it will. There's a lot of technical jargon and all the rest of it, but a little bit like British nuclear capability, although we are very wedded to the Americans, as Dom has said, the actual firing chain is our own. And the British Storm Shadow missiles that we have given to Ukrainians, although some of the detailed targeting information might not be as robust as it has when the Americans have got all their kit turned on, it will not affect, as far as I understand it, the ability for the Ukrainians to use British Storm Shadow missiles.
And now we sit down with Sir Bill Browder and legal expert Yuliya Ziskina on their efforts to convince European nations and leaders to use frozen Russian assets to fund the military effort in Ukraine as well as reparations. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Sir Bill Browder and Yuliya Ziskina. Sir Bill, congratulations on your fairly recent knighthood. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the work that has brought you this honour?
So I've been fighting with Vladimir Putin since he killed my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, actually even before that. And for a long time, I was shunned by most of British polite society because everyone loved all the money that was coming here. But when the war started, everyone said, well, Bill, you were right. And actually, we need somebody who was fighting Putin. And I think that my fight with Putin is what elevated me to this knighthood.
Well, congratulations. Your fight over the last 3 years since the beginning of the war has focused on Russian frozen assets. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So when the war started, I watched it on TV and I thought to myself, this is the most horrifying thing I've ever seen. It was what we thought was the most powerful military in the world rolling across the border to this, what we thought was a defenseless country. And of course, everyone's emotional reaction was, what can I do about this? And, I knew doctors and nurses that went to the front line. I knew lawyers that were helping refugees. And I thought, well, what skills do I have that could be helpful? And I spent the last 15 years going around parliaments and governments convincing them to pass legislation to freeze Russian assets. And as this war started, and the first thing that was done was that $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves were frozen. And I thought I could use my unique skill set as I could use the same contacts in government and parliaments to confiscate that money and have that money given to Ukraine for the obvious damage that had been done and will be done. And it seemed to me like the most obvious thing in the world that should be done. And so I've spent the last 3+ years going and visiting with the same people who are in my Magnitsky network and saying, let's confiscate this money. And it's been remarkably uphill battle for something so morally, financially, and politically correct, but we're a lot closer today than we were when I first started.
And we'll come back to the particular moment that we're in. But just to go back on the Magnitsky Act that you pushed forward in the United States and that has since then been adopted by 35 countries. Can you just remind our listeners what that is? And do you think there could be an expanded Magnitsky Act as part of a just peace if that were ever to happen?
So the Magnitsky Act is a piece of legislation named after my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, who uncovered a massive government corruption scheme in Russia perpetrated by high-level officials, including Vladimir Putin. He exposed the crime. He was subsequently arrested, tortured for 358 days, and murdered in Russian police custody at the age of 37. And so I was looking for some way to get justice for him. And there were no tools to get justice in Russia, and really no tools to get justice outside of Russia. And so I said, if there's no tools that exist, we need to invent one. And that became the Magnitsky Act. And what the Magnitsky Act does is it freezes the assets and bans the travel of the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky and the people who commit similar human rights abuses in Russia and around the world. And as you mentioned, it's now been implemented in 35 countries. And it's become the sort of major tool for redress when something terrible happens by a corrupt or evil regime. And the Magnitsky Act set the ground for all the other sanctions because we didn't have to have a big argument for 3 years when the war started about what to do. And so immediately when the war started, in addition to freezing the money belonging to the Russian Federation, we also froze the money that belonged to the oligarchs and other Russian officials. And that didn't require any debate because we had spent all that time debating the Magnitsky Act. And so it's become a very, very powerful tool, and of course something that Putin doesn't want at all. In terms of what we should call the confiscation of the $300 billion, I don't think we need to overlap with Magnitsky. There's been a terrible injustice done to Ukraine, and whatever the Ukrainians think we should call it, we should call it. But first thing, we need to actually confiscate that money.
Okay. And the conversation right now is about what can we do with these assets. I think it's David Lammy who said that Europe has to act quickly. Macron yesterday in the FT said we could hold on to the $200 billion. Why is this a good moment for Europe and for the UK and the EU to act and take hold of these assets?
It's not a good moment. It's a desperate moment. A few days ago, Donald Trump canceled U.S. military aid for Ukraine. He also just today canceled U.S. intelligence sharing with Ukraine. Ukraine has a very motivated group of soldiers, but they don't have the resources like Russia has without foreign aid to fight back. The U.S. made up 40% of the foreign military aid for Ukraine, and they've just stepped out of the picture. And so for us in the UK and for the Europeans, we need to figure out what to do. And obviously we can't let Ukraine fall. The cost of that is immeasurable in all sorts of different ways. And so we need to figure out how to support Ukraine. And we're basically left with two choices. We can either double down and ask all of our citizens to pay a lot more money in taxes to fund Ukrainians. Or alternatively, we can confiscate the money that's been frozen and have Vladimir Putin pay for defending the Ukrainians defending themselves. I can't imagine any politician choosing to tax their citizens more when they have this money sitting there that you can just confiscate. And there's both a legal argument and a moral argument for doing it. And it just seems to me that now is the desperate moment that we need to do this.
Why do you think they haven't done it before?
They haven't done it before because everyone was just hoping that the war would end, hoping that somehow everything would be fine. And it's not fine. And now we're put in this position where the war hasn't ended. It's going to carry on. The Americans have stepped out. And it's our responsibility.
Do you think it's a form of political cowardice that they haven't done it?
Of course. I mean, it's unbelievable. I mean, it's shocking, actually. All the weaselly excuses I got from all sorts of different officials about why it couldn't be done. And normally that would be demoralizing and I would not carry on, except that I've been through this process before. I had heard the same weaselly excuses when I was trying to get the Magnitsky Act done. And many officials and the EU and even here in the UK were all finding all sorts of reasons why it couldn't be done. And I knew that you just keep on hammering away, and eventually, if you have a righteous cause, one that makes sense, you eventually break through the wall.
So this is the moment where we might be breaking through the wall. What does that look like in practice? And I think, Yuliya, maybe that's more of a question for you because you've been looking at the technicalities around this. What are some of the legal hurdles that you've come across in your work?
Sure. So just to backtrack a little bit and give you some background, my focus was in public international law and financial enforcement. So this is really a convergence of those two principles. This is legal under international law. That has already been established by the world's leading international law practitioners, scholars, and including a member of the United Nations International Law Commission itself. The remaining legal arguments for the past 3 or so years have been largely a smokescreen. They are an excuse to not follow through and to not take concrete action based on various political arguments and resistance and, like Bill said, cowardice. When people invoke international law or it's illegal, then that shuts down the conversation. So that's what I want to start with, that big picture. But in terms of practicality, there is actually an international law doctrine that is meant for situations exactly like this. To first start out with, the money cannot go back to Russia. We need to start out with that first principle. There are only 2 places lawfully it can go. One is to Ukraine and the other is to Russia. Going back to Russia is not an option. So,
from a moral standpoint?
For a moral standpoint.
Or from a legal standpoint?
Both.
Okay.
And I will explain why. So under the doctrine of state countermeasures, which is a recognized doctrine by the UN International Law Commission, this provides the legal basis for enforcing the debt that Russia already owes to victims of its war, to Ukraine. This is recognized. This is a recognized international law principle. However, we all know that Russia is never going to willingly pay reparations to Ukraine because never in its history of imperialistic conquest has it paid reparations, and it's certainly not going to now. So the idea is that countermeasures are a self-help tool for nations to enforce international obligations. And exactly in situations like this, where we don't have established institutions like the UN Security Council, because the aggressor itself sits on the UN Security Council. The principle is that when a country's misconduct is so egregious that it violates the very core norms of international law, it is considered to affect the entire global community, and any state has the right to take countermeasures against it. So there's two principles. Countermeasures are intended to stop the wrongful conduct and to also compel the payment of compensation. We are talking about compensation here. So by definition, countermeasures are something that would be unlawful. So yes, I suppose you could make the argument it's unlawful. However, the wrongfulness of that act is precluded because the action is taken against a country that violated international law in the first place and it won't come back into compliance with it. So an asset freeze is actually an example of a countermeasure. We've already taken countermeasures. Normally, interfering with another state's property is unlawful. So confiscation and seizure and transfer of that money is just another phase of that countermeasure. The basic idea is that no country can have it both ways. Aggressors can't violate every part of the rule of law and then use it to claim protection for their property. That's never something that the law was intended to uphold. Human rights were always supposed to be forefront of international law, and property does not deserve more protections than that. We need to keep that principle in mind.
When we're talking about reparations, are we talking about money that would go to Ukraine, the country with a specific goal in mind, to fund the military, to rebuild infrastructure? Are we talking about compensation to private citizens? What are we talking about?
There are so many purposes for this money. And right now, defense. We need it for defense. It's a very practical matter. The U.S., like Bill said, has canceled its support. We can't reconstruct Ukraine if there is no Ukraine. However, at the same time, there are countless victims of Russia's illegal invasion, people who have lost their homes, their families, who have been tortured. They are entitled to reparations and compensation. So how this money is distributed will be a question for later, with the Ukrainians, of course, being part of these discussions. The Ukrainians are best placed to know where that money needs to go. However, the first question is transferring it and removing it from just sitting frozen in Western financial institutions with no use to anyone.
So, Bill, do you think in the current moment where Donald Trump is trying to push Zelensky into surrender and pushing him into a corner where he can't negotiate and he's got to accept whatever offer that Trump is putting on the table, could he use that as a tool against Ukraine, this conversation around frozen assets? Is that a likely scenario, according to you?
Well, what we see from Trump is that he wants to push Ukraine to surrender in the most horrible way. He appears to be siding with Vladimir Putin in every way. And so one of the many great things I should say about this confiscation is that he loses almost all of his leverage in this forced surrender situation. His main leverage is that we're going to cut off military aid to Ukraine. The United States is going to cut off military aid to Ukraine. And therefore, you guys are going to fall when your stuff runs out. And if Europeans and the UK and Canada and other countries take this money and give it to Ukraine to defend themselves, then all of a sudden he can't demand an unconscionable deal for Ukraine to surrender. Ukraine can then say, well, we're very upset that you're cutting us off. We found another source of funding for our war. Of course, we'd love to have you involved, but we need to end this war on our terms in a long-term peaceful way with justice for the victims. That's what I think should happen. Of course, he's dangling this military aid like he could turn it back on again if everybody does what they're supposed to do. He's really been sadistic about this with Zelensky. I mean, the way he treated him in the Oval Office and the way he treated him after the Oval Office and the way all his minions talk about him on television after the Oval Office is really just sadistic. And it'd be nice to see the Europeans who do support Zelensky in Ukraine to say, okay, let's take this money and let's have a different conversation.
The Germans and the French have been very cold about using these frozen assets. What do you think they've been afraid of for the last 3 years? And what are they afraid to lose? Do they have assets themselves in Russia? Is there a question of retaliation?
I think the main thing that they're afraid of is Christine Lagarde, who's at the European Central Bank, has said, oh, this will hurt the euro. Most politicians aren't lawyers. And then they have a good idea that they want to do. And then some lawyer deep in the bowels of the government raises his hand and said, that can't be done for such and such reason, just because they make that reason up. And if you're not a lawyer and you have a lawyer telling you that it can't be done, you don't really know how to argue against it. And so you have this combination of, oh, it can't be done. The lawyers say it can't be done legally. You have Christine Lagarde saying it's going to mess up the euro. And they just say, oh, we just don't want to get involved in this whole thing. And hopefully it all ends and we don't have to even think about it. And so we've gotten to this situation where if they had done it 6 months ago, the United States would have done it alongside them. And there's not a whole lot of money in the United States, but it would have been nice to have everybody do it together. And now we're in this much more uncomfortable situation where we're going to have to do it without the United States because obviously Trump is not going to do it. And by the way, as far as Christine Lagarde goes, you're not going to have a euro if this whole thing blows up the way it could blow up. And so I think she shouldn't be in a position to veto this. I don't want my sons and daughters going to die in a war with Russia because Christine Lagarde is worrying about the euro.
I think that's a fair point. What sort of precedent could it create for the international community? Do you want to address that, Yuliya?
Absolutely. So we often hear the argument that this will create a bad precedent, it'll create a slippery slope, oh no, it'll open Pandora's box and the floodgates. I would say to the extent that it creates a precedent, it creates a very positive one. It shows that aggressors cannot invade a sovereign country, commit hundreds of thousands of horrible war crimes, and then simply not pay. That is entirely the wrong precedent that we want to set. And the longer these assets remain immobilized, we are sending a message to Russia and to other potential aggressors that their assets will simply remain frozen or even potentially return back to them if they simply wait long enough. That's why immediate action needs to be taken, and we've waited long enough to do that. As well, in addition to that, there's this, I think, illogical fallacy of thinking that only action creates precedent, but that's not true. Inaction creates just as much precedent as action. By not taking action here, we are setting the wrong precedent, and one that will be very dangerous to our collective democratic values going forward.
So what you're saying is this inaction from European powers has created as much a financial war of attrition as it has created a military war of attrition.
Exactly. This war has a center of gravity in the economic front, just as much as it has on the battlefield. We see this in so many ways with the sanctions, with how Russia is undermining Ukraine's main industries. And Russia is counting on this war of attrition. It is counting on the West to get tired of it, to stop supporting Ukraine, and to eventually even lift sanctions, which I would be remiss not to bring up that we are very much in danger of that happening. I think people don't realize that it's not a given, that these assets will remain indefinitely frozen forever and we'll have tons of time to make up our minds. That's simply not true. The EU extends sanctions every 6 months. The next extension is coming up in July. The EU needs unanimous approval from the 27 member states in order to keep those sanctions. So far, the EU has been able to secure the acceptance of Hungary and Slovakia, but this time around is quite different. With U.S. pressure and the U.S. trying to close in on a quick deal with Russia, Hungary and Slovakia could well be emboldened. And as soon as those sanctions are lifted, that $200 billion that is in Europe, gone. That is not reversible. The Central Bank of Russia makes a claim on Euroclear that is holding that money. Euroclear would have to comply. That money goes back to Russia. Europe loses its biggest weapon. We cannot let that happen.
So, Bill, one last question from me. Macron yesterday in the Financial Times proposed that $200 billion could be held onto in case Russia breaks a ceasefire, should a ceasefire agreement come to be. It would be a sort of guarantee. What do you think of that proposal?
I think it's more of the same nonsense of him not wanting to do what needs to be done. If he breaks the ceasefire, there's plenty of other ways to punish him. We need to take that money right now so that the Ukrainians can punish him most severely with the weapons that they buy with that $200 billion if he breaks the ceasefire.
I would like to just add on to that. This idea of leverage has been floated around since the very beginning. The quote goes, "The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result." These frozen assets for 3 years have not created any difference in Putin's war calculus. If we would have seen an effect, we would have seen it already. Putin has dedicated hundreds of billions of dollars to this war. Russia's stated objective is to erase Ukraine and Ukrainian sovereignty. Putin does not want the assets back. Putin wants Ukraine.
Any final thoughts, anything that you'd like to add maybe?
So we very recently heard from Prime Minister Keir Starmer being asked the question of what is happening with these assets. And the response was, it's complicated and we're looking into it. Yes, it is a complicated topic, but many topics are complicated. I am reminded back to about 2 years ago at Davos on a panel exactly about frozen Russian assets, and the same question was asked to a U.S. government official. What are we doing with the frozen assets? And the same answer was given by her. It's complicated. We need a team of lawyers on it. I will just say we do not need more lawyers. It has been complicated for over 2 years now. As the Germans would like to probably say, we need to stop admiring the problem and actually start solving it.
I'm sure they can find a team of lawyers as well.
Exactly. It's really a question of political will. If the political will is there, everything falls into place. So in a lot of ways, I think this conversation has been gone about backwards in a sense. We need the political will first, and then the lawyers can tell us how to do it, not whether to do it. It's a very different legal way of thinking on how to do something versus whether. And the whether here is very, very clear.
How do you think Trump is going to react should these frozen assets start being used by the EU and sent to Ukraine?
Well, I think it would put Ukraine in a much stronger negotiating position. So far, he has blocked Ukraine from being at the negotiating table. This creates a spot for Europe and Ukraine to even possibly create their own negotiating table that Trump has to come to. It gives them the ultimate, no pun intended, Trump card.
So, Bill, what do you think is going to be Trump's reaction should that happen?
You know, it puts him in a position he doesn't want to be put in, which is that all of a sudden there are other people at the table. And he wants to be the only important guy. And he didn't want Ukraine to be at the table. He didn't want the Europeans to be at the table. All of a sudden, there's a lot of people with a lot of interests that aren't his. I mean, I can imagine he has a huge temper tantrum.
Are you optimistic that the frozen assets might finally get to Ukraine in the near future?
I think the frozen assets will get to Ukraine in the future, and I think it's going to happen pretty quickly. I think that the last couple weeks have been such a shock to the whole world, and particularly the people making this decision, that all that nonsense that we heard will go by the wayside.
You know, I really wish as a society we didn't wait until collective tragedy and crisis to do the right thing. I just keep thinking back to when Biden was in office. So I worked on the Repo Act. I was very active in trying to help pass it through Congress. It helped with the legal basis. And Congress passed it, despite so many people saying, it'll never pass, it'll never pass. Well, Congress passed it, Biden signed it into law. Biden had a golden opportunity to actually implement the Repo Act, to actually seize the Russian assets that are in the U.S. and simply keep them for safekeeping. It wouldn't have needed to be transferred to Ukraine right away. They would have just been taken outside of the president's control. He didn't do that.
Why not?
The official excuse was that, well, we're waiting for the political will from the G7 for everybody to agree to do it. However, that was the wrong strategy, because we ended up moving at the speed of the slowest, the speed of the most cynical, and then unable to answer to those urgent challenges. By nobody stepping up to take decisive action, no action was taken, and we ended up paralyzed and now at risk of losing it all. So this is what I meant by inaction being just as dangerous as action. So we would have been in a much better position now had Biden actually been brave enough to use the powers that Congress gave him.
let's go to our final thoughts. I will start. Today, I want to talk about 2 articles published in Le Monde this week. One is a very candid interview with a commander in an air defense unit in the Odessa region on what the cut of US military aid will mean for the forces on the ground. His name is Alexei, no last name, obviously for security reason, and I'll just give you one quote from the interview. He says, "This will be worse than at the beginning of the invasion because Russia is even more aggressive now." And then a second read for your weekend, also from Le Monde. That one is a deep dive into private Chinese citizens who've decided to join ranks with Russian forces fighting in Ukraine. Now, on the Chinese version of TikTok, so a video-based social media network, Le Monde has identified at least 40 accounts of people claiming to have enrolled in the Russian forces with video and images to prove it. Harold Thibault, Le Monde's correspondent in Beijing, interviewed one of these men, call sign Fen. Now, Fen discusses how he decided to enroll, not knowing much about the war in Ukraine. He took a train to Krasnodar with the intention to join the Wagner paramilitary group. Sadly for him, I guess, he wasn't on top of the news, and Evgeny Prigozhin had just rebelled against Putin. So Wagner, at that point, wasn't really hiring anymore. Then he talks about how he turned to the regular army to enroll and describes his recruitment process. It was very short, he says. They gave him a questionnaire asking for his phone number, the name of his parents, and some very basic medical information. He says it was very simple. It's really interesting. It will give you a glimpse on how regular people across Asia are decided to join ranks with Russia. It is a bit of a sidestep from what we usually talk about, and certainly something I hadn't heard about. So we will post to that in the show notes. And now, Dom, over to you for your final thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Adélie. So I said earlier that I would address one of the Kremlin's key lies about the reason for this war, that of NATO's alleged violation of obligations not to expand eastward at the end of the Cold War. And for chapter and verse on this, I turn to the international affairs think tank Chatham House. So in July 1990, the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev agreed to a united Germany's incorporation into NATO. The US Secretary of State at the time, James Baker, had previously told Gorbachev that NATO's jurisdiction would not move beyond the inner German border. That's the not 1 inch comment. But Washington then saw it would be unworkable to have part of Germany inside the alliance and part of Germany outside the alliance. So as part of the deal reached by Gorbachev and the West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, no forces of other NATO countries would be deployed on the former German Democratic Republic territory, i.e. the former East Germany, until Soviet forces had left, and then only temporarily. There would also be no deployment of nuclear weapons, and Moscow was going to get, and did get, financial sweeteners, including 12 billion Deutschmarks to resettle returning troops. Now, throughout that time, Gorbachev neither asked for nor was offered any formal guarantees that there would be no further expansion of NATO beyond the territory of a united Germany. The issue was not even under discussion at NATO at the time, since the Warsaw Pact and the USSR still existed. Even if we now know the Warsaw Pact's days were clearly numbered, there was no expectation in the autumn of 1990 that the USSR was going to collapse a year later. Also, in November 1990, the USSR signed the Charter of Paris, which had a commitment to fully recognise the freedom of states to choose their own security arrangements. Now, the Kremlin says, don't forget that in November 1990, the USSR and Warsaw Pact were still in existence, so that clause in the Charter of Paris was only talking about the new Germany. OK, maybe. But fast forward to 1997, long after the USSR had collapsed, and the signing of the NATO-Russia Founding Act. That pledged respect for, quote, the inherent right of all states to choose the means to ensure their own security. Russia, then a sovereign state once more, no longer part of the USSR, signed that act. So please, challenge where you can this Kremlin narrative that NATO promised not to expand eastwards. It is just hogwash. Thanks, Adélie.
Hamish, do you want to have the last word?
Thanks very much. And I don't want to dig up any ground we've covered today, but when we're looking at the peace enforcement force that both Starmer and Macron have been talking about, we've covered already that both Lavrov and Putin the last 24 hours have said no NATO troops on Ukraine soil of any peace enforcement force. Well, to me, that is saying to Putin and Vance and Hegseth that the Russians are not interested in peace, because there is no other force that could provide that military heft for a peace enforcement force in Ukraine. The Chinese certainly aren't going to do it. We look at other NATO countries, non-NATO countries might do it, the Australians, perhaps a few others, but this has got to be such a considerably effective force with the surveillance and also the bang to be able to deter any aggression. I cannot see it is going to be possible to have a force that is not made up of predominantly NATO countries. Thank you.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. And please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X, formerly known as Twitter, so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Frances Durnley, Louisa Wells, and David Nicholls.